Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joe, and I'm from the Festival of Debate. Tonight's event is part of the 2021 Festival of Debate, an annual programme coordinated by the social enterprise Opus Independence, which brings people together to share new ideas that can help shape our understanding of the world. This year's programme is Pay What You Feel to ensure all of our online events are free at the point of access, but we do rely on donations from audience members to help us make it happen. You can donate by going to festivalofdebate.com, and we'll also share a PayPal link in tonight's chat. You can also tweet us if you'd like at Fest of Debate on Twitter. The festival team will be monitoring the chat. We'd like to ask all audience members to please be respectful of others, and we will remove anyone from our events who does not follow our safer festival policy, which is available on our website. If you'd like to ask any questions tonight, please do. We'll be coming to sort of a Q&A section a bit later on as part of tonight's event, so you can use the Q&A box or the chat box to send some questions to our panel, which they will get to later. I'm very happy to introduce our chair for tonight's event. If you could please welcome Monica.
Hi there, thank you, Joe. Welcome everyone to our discussion on racism in education. We have with us today two sixth form students, Ella and Tyra, a parent organizer, Melissa Simmonds, and Dr. Muna Abdi, who is an educational expert. My name is Monica. I have been teaching secondary school for about 14 years now. And the beginning of that journey as an educator was in California, where issues of race and education are perhaps more widely recognized, certainly in light of recent events. And I have to admit that when I immigrated to England 5 years ago, I was surprised to find the same patterns of behavior and racism that I observed in Los Angeles. Whether it was a white man outside of my London school chanting the N-word repeatedly at a young Black woman so loudly that it disrupted my year 10 class. Or earlier this year when a year 7 student, 11 years old, who is British Asian, told me about a racist incident that happened to her when she was 9 in primary school. Ultimately, what I've realized as an educator here in Britain is that racism in education continues to exist, and that it continues to influence, to impact, and to traumatize students of every background. And so with that in mind, I want to join and invite you to join in this conversation and to listen to the experiences of our panelists and ultimately to the solutions that they have to offer in terms of racism in education in Britain. I'd like to begin by just asking our panelists to share the reality of racism that they've experienced at some point in secondary schools. And with that in mind, Ella, if you could join us. Ella is a year 12 student at a secondary school in Sheffield. Hi, welcome.
Hi.
Hi, so we just want to have you share a little bit about your experience and kind of what is your response when we say, what is the reality of racism in schools?
Yeah, I think it's painfully present in everyday life in schools. You see it in the unconscious bias of teachers, just it's so naturally there. For example, at breaks and lunch times, there'll always be more monitoring, more eyes on a group of Black kids than there ever would be on their white peers. And also in the stereotyping of Black and members of the BAME community, people of colour, kind of everyone that isn't white, you're put in a box by staff, people of authority in the school, just because of society's perspectives and perceptions of people of colour. You know, the classic Black boys are violent, angry girls are, well, they're Black girls. Obviously, it wouldn't be a white person, they couldn't fit into that category. And in my personal experience, I've, been given the blame for a situation because I've been seen as intimidating. And I know that my white peer would have never been told that if the situation was reversed. It was purely the fact that I was from an ethnic minority. And it was so upsetting because for ages I wondered, you know, is that me? Am I an intimidating person? And it took a long time for me to kind of look back and think, I'm not intimidating. That person they just saw my ethnicity. That's all I was to them. And I think, you know, lastly, it's the dismissal of racism, racial slurs, microaggressions. They just slide by every day. That's not just members of staff, it's in the students as well. In students, I think it causes probably the biggest divide because, you know, one person may use a racial slur and, you know, someone who takes that racial slur offensively will say, no, that's not okay. And they'll make a decision to avoid that person, which is a respectable decision because it's uncomfortable to be around people who think that it's okay to use those kind of everyday things that are racist that we just kind of let go. But then their white peers aren't calling it out as well, which they should be, because it creates this environment where you're not as comfortable as you could be. You can't express an opinion on everything. It's not an environment where you feel, let me just, you know, tell my friends this, tell my friends that, because, you know, they're not saying to this person, no, what you've done is wrong. They're just staying neutral, and we all have to be anti-racist. And then in staff, when it's kind of brought up, the racial slurs, the microaggressions, they're never taken seriously. Not as seriously as you'd ever want them to be taken. It's kind of just, they're tolerated. You know, it might be, oh, you shouldn't have said that, can you apologise? Rather than realising the true impact that the racial slurs has on people's lives. And I think it just tells the BAME community, you know, doesn't matter, please just suck it up, just move on, we're tolerating this. And it just reinforces how ignored our opinions and our feelings are in the educational system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Ella. You brought up a lot of important things. You said kind of that dismissal. You've talked about having to tolerate something that, you know, really what student, what child, what adult wants to have to tolerate, kind of insults on a daily basis. And you've often also kind of brought up two different issues in terms of kind of the community that you could feel with other students and how that affects you. Thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to invite Melissa now to carry on with our ideas in terms of our reality of racism.
Hi, yeah, so I'm a mum to two children. My son is a year 11 and my daughter is a year 7, so she's just started secondary school. My experience started in primary school, where every year the teachers would regurgitate the same things during Black History Month. We'd learn about Nelson Mandela, Mary Seacole, and Martin Luther King. And some parents felt quite frustrated because we felt like the children were learning the same thing every year. And so the teachers kind of decided to use their own initiative and create something. And I was really appalled at the examples they used for Black History Month. This was 4 years ago now. So the one I can remember the most was they used Beyonce. They talked about Beyonce for Black History Month. And don't get me wrong, I don't know anybody who doesn't adore Beyonce. I absolutely love her, but it didn't feel appropriate. So myself and a white parent got together, and she's a parent who I always call her my white ally. We kind of stand in solidarity together. And we created a curriculum for the term. And, you know, I did it by year group and looked at what each class could learn about Black History Month and gave it to the head and explained that I feel that Black history could actually be woven throughout the curriculum. And it's important for Black children to see that Black people have been here since before Windrush. And it's also important for the white children to understand the contributions that Black people have made to the UK. And they completely ignored an entire curriculum I put together. And they they had people like Drake, which that year he just had a child with a porn star. And they had Lewis Hamilton, and they had a football player from Sheffield who he went to that school. And
so entertainers.
Pardon?
Entertainers.
Entertainers, basically. And it was kind of making children believe, Black children, you know, this is all we can do. We entertain the masses. And so I thought, okay, I will approach it differently. I will just focus on Black History Month. So instead of doing an entire term's curriculum, I just did stuff for Black History Month. And again, they did the same things. They completely ignored every suggestion I gave them and did even more kind of, in my eyes, disrespectful examples to celebrate. And so that led me to create a workshop called Black History Month for White Teachers and Dummies, which I initially did 2 years ago at the Festival of Debate. And what I do is I try to get the white audience to walk a mile in my shoes and kind of put them in a situation where they feel like they are marginalized. You know, they are the minority. And if you were the minority, who would you want your children to be learning about for that 1 week out of the year? And, you know, people leave the workshop feeling quite depressed and low, which is a good thing, because I want them to realize what's happening in schools. And I always invite people to go and ask their children, you know, what are you learning in school about Black history? So that's kind of like the workshop I've done. But also now my daughter is in a situation now where she's now in secondary school, and my son he's kind of happy-go-lucky, lives in his own little world. My daughter is more conscientious. So I was really worried about the school she was going to, because it is predominantly white. So one of the things when I looked around the school, I asked what percentage of the children are Black, because one of my concerns was people putting their hands in her hair, because she's got very distinguished hair, very unique hair. And it happens a lot in schools where both white teachers and white girls feel they can just touch your hair. And my daughter understands that it's a part of your body, and actually nobody has permission to touch a part of your body without permission. So that was really important to me, to kind of try to become an ally within the school, try and communicate with the school. She's had a couple of experiences where she's heard the N-word. One was a little girl asking what the N-word meant, and another child decided to tell her what it meant. And, you know, my daughter was understandably very angry. But what was lovely is her white friends around her, they were very supportive and really called this girl out. And another one happened just 2 weeks ago, just before half term, where a little boy said it in class. But my daughter felt dismissed when she was angry, because she kept asking, why have you done it? And the teacher told her, not, you know, don't keep on going on about this. It's the last day of school. We've got half term. Let's just have a good week and come back to school. And so I think I want teachers to realize that dismissive, throwaway things like that then makes the child reassess themselves, but also look at the teaching staff differently, because then the mistrust starts, and they feel that they're not part of the school community. So they're my experiences, but hopefully I will be doing some work with the school to kind of make them more aware of the parts they play in our Black children's lives.
I think that's amazing, the work that you have done and the way that you've advocated for your students and for, you know, for the community as well in general. And it's so interesting to hear from Ella and now from you that word that keeps coming up is this dismissal, and it's something that we absolutely have to address, isn't it? Because then, as you said, we become more and more disenfranchised, less and less trusting that education is going to be a safe space that it should be, and that they have our interests in mind. And I think that's something that I hear, that thread coming up again and again. Well, you talked a lot about, you know, kind of one way that you tried to help advocate was through Black History Month. Tyra, if you're going to go ahead and join us. Thank you so much, Melissa. Tyra, I remember you mentioning that at your school in year 9, there was still, there wasn't anything done yet at that point.
Yeah, so as a school, despite multiple people, staff and students, you know, going to the people at the top of where the decisions are made, despite people going, it wasn't really introduced until the George Floyd incident, until it sort of hit that this was an issue worldwide. And for me, as one of 2 female Black students in a predominantly white school, you felt very isolated. You didn't feel like you had an ally. You didn't feel like you had anybody to go to when racist comments were made. It was very lonely, if anything. And it's just sort of having somebody that understands what you're going through more than anything. And obviously being in a predominantly white school, you know, you get the comments, there's ignorance, and I feel like the ignorance at such a young age could have very easily been prevented if the education of Black History Month and just racism in general, if that education was there, I don't think that the ignorance would have grown to the level that it had done. And again, like Melissa said, my hair is naturally curly, and I'd say from year 7 to year 9, I had it naturally curly, and then I remember coming back in September in year 10 and making the decision to straighten my hair because I was sick of people touching it. And it's one of those things where the fact that people feel like it's okay to just come and touch you and not sort of acknowledge how that makes you feel. You know, for me personally, it makes me feel like I'm in a petting zoo, and it's like, oh, your hair's like so extravagant and so unique, and it's like, yes, it is, but that's not the way to go about it in that sort of sense. I've also had a lot of girls, even as far as up to year 11, so the age of 16, I came in with my hair naturally curly, and they pointed, they laughed, they called it wild, very, very immature and very ignorant. And that is something that I feel that can be changed if, you know, if the education was there in the first place. And the fact that it hasn't, and the fact that, you know, when the comments have been made in the classroom or on the playground or anything like that, the fact that the teachers haven't acknowledged it, and if it has been acknowledged, it's been dismissed very, very quickly and sort of just brushed under the carpet. I do feel like sort of you feel alone, because you feel like the people, you know, you get told when you're a child, if anything's going wrong at school, you know, go to a teacher. And you do, because they're in a position where they're supposed to help you. And the fact that they're very dismissive about it, it's very upsetting to hear that and to see that.
Yeah, and I mean, that story that you shared, and you're saying that that's happened more than once. You know, we're moving as a society further and further into understanding, you know, what harassment is, and that things, you know, death by 1,000 cuts, that it isn't a small thing to continually have that, especially historically, the exoticization of Black women, the you know, you said you used the word petting zoo. I mean, these are things that historically, if you, like, have so much impact and have so much background to them, and to continue to have to experience those day in and day out, like, what does that do? You are, remind me, are you 17 now?
Yeah, I'm 17.
You've had so much of your childhood where you're having to respond to this on a daily basis. And speaking of your childhood, you know, I think you had mentioned to me before that one of the first times that you, in secondary school, that you felt some sort of racist abuse was when you were year 7, 11 years old, just right at the beginning. Would you mind sharing that incident and kind of how you felt about that and what unfolded?
Yeah, so it was on my 2-week induction of secondary school, so I hadn't even moved there yet officially, and we went on like a residential, just to sort of get to know each other. Moving up to big school, it's a big step from primary school, etc. And everything was fine, until this one girl decided to call me the N-word. Now at the age of 11, it's sort of, you don't know the full meaning of that word. You just know that it's not a nice word to say. You know that it's racist, and you know that it shouldn't be said. So for me to hear that in the first 2 weeks of secondary school, meeting new people, because I came up to secondary school on my own, not knowing anybody, so that was a big enough challenge as it was. Then to face, racial abuse, it was challenging. It was hard. So she said what she said, and I think it for me, I just took a massive step back, and I was like, at that moment in time, I didn't have anybody else to turn to. My friend Tawana didn't come till year 8, and she's the only other Black girl in my year group. So I was on my own. I was very much on my own, and there wasn't a member of staff that was a person of colour either. So it was sort of, I went to my form tutor. I told my form tutor about it when I got back off of the residential. We went into school with my parents, and it was acknowledged, but again, it was dismissed. The student got put in isolation for the day, and I did receive an apology letter, but I don't think that the discussion of why it's wrong happened. And that seems to be a common pattern in a lot of my experiences that I've had throughout secondary school, is that the punishment is there, but the reasoning as to why it's not okay to say that and how it affects that other person isn't there. And that's why it continues to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Tyra, for sharing your experience, and we look forward to hearing some of your solutions in a few minutes. Dr. Muna Abdi, if you will join us, and we're talking about the reality, and you've heard these various experiences from both student parents. What is your perspective on this? Can you draw any conclusions or thoughts in a wider perspective of education for us?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for creating this platform and for inviting us on, and for everybody for sharing their experiences. It's not easy. As somebody who is a Black woman who has gone through the UK education system, I know it's not easy to talk about it over and over again, and especially in spaces where you are doing it to educate others on what that experience is and the impact of that experience. What I would start off by saying is that often when we talk about racism in schools, and racism in secondary schools in particular, whether it's in academic spaces, policy conversations, or just in late discussions that we're having like today, we focus on the metrics, we focus on numbers a lot, we focus on racial disparities in attainment, we look at exclusion, etc. And those numbers are important. Those structural barriers that we see are important, and they have really profound material consequences for people that go through the education system. But we're missing something in the conversation, and that is the everyday experiences of racism, the culture of racism that exists within schools, the unspoken aspects of racism that are felt and experienced acutely and are visible to people of colour within the spaces, but are not part of the conversations that we are having. And what ends up happening is that when people do share their experiences, like all of our panelists have, or if there is an incident within a school, it's treated as an isolated case. And the individuals who are involved in those incidences, as outlined in all of the examples that people have mentioned so far, the approach from the institution, the approach from the structure, is to see those who are impacted in a position of deficit. And that means seeing that the problem somehow lies with them. They're not resilient enough to deal with what they're experiencing in that space. They need support with their well-being because they are the ones that are needing help to deal with it. It doesn't look at the environment. It doesn't look at how that space is being experienced as unsafe, experienced as threatening, and creating various types of vulnerabilities for people in those spaces. It also doesn't take into account how incidences such as those are dealt with send a message to all students. And what I often find in the work that I do is that many schools will say to me, the majority of our students are white, and therefore how do we deal with issues around race and racism? And my response to them is, this is just as important for students who are racialized as white as it is for Black students, because we learn about these dynamics of race and racism through those everyday interactions. White students learn about what is acceptable and unacceptable, and Black students do as well. And so it's really important for us to bridge the conversations about cultural racism and the culture of racism in schools and the structural barriers that we can see and evidence directly in front of us. And at the moment, there is a different conversation that is happening in isolation, and those two things are not coming together. I was in a meeting earlier on today where a school was talking about trying to deal with something that was to do with representation. But the underlying issue in the case that they were exploring was that parents and students at their school didn't feel as though they had a voice. They didn't feel as though they were visible. They didn't feel as though their lived experiences were valued within that school space. And that is what we really need to be addressing, is what is the root cause of the problems that we're looking at within schools, and not just dealing with the symptoms. And that is across the board for educators, for students, for parents. It's sometimes easier for us to deal with the symptoms because it's the thing that we can name and that we can identify. And it takes a lot more hard work to question what it is that's the underlying issue around this. And sometimes that is looking at the structures and who do these structures benefit and who do they disadvantage by design. And that's a really important question for us to ask. It is about asking what are the practices that we are enabling within the spaces that we're in. And it is about valuing lived experiences, not just asking people to share their lived experiences, but creating spaces where those experiences can actually inform the decisions that we make. And unfortunately, that's not in the conversations that we're having at the moment. We're asking people to share what is essentially trauma and relive their trauma, and it's not feeding into the structural and systemic changes that we need to be making within schools. So I really do honor this space, and I appreciate everybody for sharing their stories. I wish we got to a point where we didn't have to do this anymore.
Yeah, thank you so much. When you talk about having to reshare trauma in order to, we framed this conversation with this sharing of stories first, because so often what we end up hearing is that racism isn't a big deal, doesn't happen. And so it feels as though we have to continue to say, look, here are all these experiences just from these, three different voices that we've heard, in our community up in Sheffield and Rotherham, and they have multiple experiences. We had to have a chat to narrow it down so that we weren't here for hours and hours. And what does that mean that we have to share those first to help frame our conversation? Thank you so much for bringing it in, and how we need to then, hopefully, if we're listening to those voices, then we can make some systemic change and recognize that those are the symptoms and that they're not individual cases. That's what we're trying to say here, is that ultimately these are showing that there's a culture, as you said, Muna, there's a culture of silencing, of othering, of racist incidents that's happening every day in education, and that our schools are perpetuating trauma. And that's happening today, not 50 years ago. It's happening right now. With that in mind, I want to hopefully shift the conversation to a space where our audience can begin to think about what are the next steps for them, for you listening right now. How can you take these experiences and create solutions, create spaces in which you are being an advocate for a more just educational system, and where you are becoming a person who is truly acting in an anti-racist way every single day. And so I'm going to ask Ella to come back and join us again. And she's had some time to think with a group of her peers at her secondary school. And they've come up with together some ideas in terms of, okay, what are some next steps? What are some solutions?
Yeah, so we discussed primarily having black role models and authority figures in the school. I think this stems from the idea that you are so isolated as a person of colour, a minority, because you're the minority in that school as well. And it's difficult to turn to a white person and have a conversation about racism and the racism you're experiencing in school, because you never know how they're going to react. Are they going to isolate you even further? So having that person that you know is going to relate and you can turn to and kind of just say, look, this is happening. Can you please understand? Can you help me, without having feeling, oh, that's so daunting? Because especially when you're young, year sevens, year eights, like that is a scary thing to turn around and do. I think as you get older, you might not have the strength to do it. It's still a bit of give and take. So having that, an opportunity, a place where you can just go, discuss it, kind of have someone also in your corner, someone who's not going to dismiss it instantly. I feel like everyone's mentioned the dismissal of racism, and just having that one teacher who's not going to dismiss it.
And I think that is amazing, Ella, too, because, ultimately, if I might be a little off on my statistic, but I believe 92% of the teacher population in Britain is white, which isn't representative of the overall population. And, you've talked about having someone to go and speak to, and how important that is, that, someone's there who, is not going to dismiss. What other thoughts have you had?
Yeah, we had training on unconscious bias. It happens at some schools. It probably doesn't happen in the way it needs to happen. I think a lot of people know the words, they've heard the words, but they weren't given what it looks like in school and how you're going to challenge that. It's something we all have. It's just part of, well, kind of British society at this point. But I think we kind of just hear the words and we think, oh, yeah, unconscious bias, like, I've got it, but nothing really happens. You just know it's there. Kind of, you want the training to happen so they know what it looks like, they know how to recognize it, they know how to deal with it, and also kind of how to reflect on yourself and make sure that you're changing that. Because I think conversations about racism are really difficult. And if you want to make a change, you always have to look at yourself and think, what am I doing? How can I do this better? I think no matter what your ethnicity, there is always that opportunity to learn something and become better for your, not just for yourself, for your peers, even if it's just you knowing that it's wrong and being able to say, this is wrong and here's why, because I've gone and done my research. I think that is kind of the strength, and then you'd hope that things would turn around. And we lastly talked about incorporating black voices into decision making in the schools. Probably a lot of schools, because it just seems so obvious, have a zero tolerance policy on racism. I feel like I can guess that that's there without even having to check, but no one's making sure that black voices are being listened to. I remember when me and my friends were discussing this for this debate, we went and researched and we looked at governing bodies of several secondary schools in Sheffield, and we saw that pretty much none of them, I think only one of them had a black person on their governing body. So we thought, they might be able to say, here's our anti-racism policy, but it's never going to reflect what racism is like in school, because if you're not listening to black voices, black people, people of colour, their experiences, and also what they say to fix what they want to happen to make sure it doesn't happen anymore, then you're never kind of going to get any real change. Because I think once you start talking about racism and you hear what it is really like, because I think at the beginning jaws just do drop, because you think, how is this happening? How have we not done anything? I think as soon as you start listening to people and just truly hearing them, then you're kind of like, okay, what do we need to do to make it better for you? When you ask that question and you just turn it around and put it into motion to make sure that things get better.
Thank you so much. Those are three amazing solutions. And again, you know, that's what Festival of Debate is here for, is to provide you with some thoughts. And so Ella has, you know, she's talked about, you know, first of all, who is in education? How can we reinforce our educators looking more like the demographics of our country? But also, you know, two things. The second thing that she said was really, really powerful, and that's that any person who's watching can go away and consider their positionality on a daily basis. And so what I mean by that is, as Ella said, some of us may have had a little training here or watched a conversation there, but are you having these conversations? Are you bringing them up with your families, with your peers, with your colleagues? Are you carrying on really thinking about the bias that is part of your life, a part of everyone's life, in the sense that we're all part of this system? And then finally, that influence in terms of governing bodies. And are you listening to Black voices? Are you listening to voices of people of color about what to do? And if you're trying to organize without having that conversation anywhere, then that's something that you've got to find, and that can be uncomfortable. So Ella, thank you so much. And your group of, I know that there was quite a group of you at your school who thought about it. Melissa, I was wondering if from a parental perspective, if you could offer a few words of just what can parents who are watching, who, you know, have students in school of every background, what is something that you think might be a solution or a next step for them following this conversation?
I think as a parent of any ethnicity, it's important to know what your children are being taught. And actually, if you genuinely care about education, and if you're genuinely anti-racist, you want your children to be learning the truth in school about history. And actually, history isn't very pretty, but we do learn about pretty horrible stuff at school, and it can be done in a way that isn't, very traumatic. So equally, you can be being honest about Black history, in my opinion. And I think when we look at colonialism and when we look at empire, we just look at like the positive bits in it. We look at what Queen Elizabeth did, but we don't kind of look at, okay, she did amazing things for her country and her subjects, but in her trying to do the best she could for her subjects, that had an adverse effect on an entire continent. You know, we're supposed to be teaching our children to be critical thinkers. And actually, in order to teach them to be critical thinkers, we have to kind of tell them the truth and teach them that, yeah, Queen Elizabeth was amazing. Sorry, my phone. Queen Elizabeth was amazing for some people, but not for others. I got a bit distracted by a question that popped up into the panelists, and it threw me a bit, because at the beginning of the question, it said that they found the presentations very negative and conflictual, and that teachers are working incredibly hard. And I felt really angry about that, actually, because anyone who knows me knows I'm like super chilled and laid back, especially in these presentations, because I know they can be quite difficult. But, you know, you heard me as a parent talk about me, having concerns about people putting their hands on my child's body. And you heard Tyra talk about, she actually physically changed her hair because people kept putting their hands on her. People laughed at her. She felt like she was being petted. I'd want to ask that person who put that, how are we supposed to pretty that up for our audience? You know, is it my job to make you feel comfortable in these workshops and in these gatherings? That's not my job. It's my job to come here and tell you the truth. And if you feel uncomfortable about it, why do you feel uncomfortable about it? And that's what I always ask people. You're not supposed to leave these thinking, oh, well, that was a fantastic session and I feel really happy. The UK is doing really, really well. If that was the reality, I wouldn't be here right now. Tonight's my birthday. I want to be drinking some gin and I can't. I'm sober having this conversation because it's incredibly important. And yeah, we're told all the time that teachers are doing their best under difficult circumstances. And, you know, COVID has taught us how much we need teachers. I cannot homeschool if my life depended on it. But equally, as a teacher, I'm entrusting you with my prized possession. I'm entrusting you with my children. My daughter shouldn't be coming home distressed because she's heard the N-word and she feels like she's been dismissed. Exactly. And so actually, you know, as schools, you need to be doing better. You need to be looking at who are the people in the room when you make decisions about zero tolerances of stuff. And if you're making zero tolerance policies, what actually happens to the child or the teacher when they've broken those rules? You know, who's part of the governing body? Is anybody making decisions? Do any of them look like me or my Black children? If not, why not? So schools need to do better, and it's my job as a parent, like any parent, to hold the school accountable when they're not doing the best that they can. Yeah. And white parents do that as well. You know, if you feel your child isn't learning maths adequately, you go and you challenge the school about it. Well, actually, I'm challenging you about something that is, we're telling you it's traumatizing our children. It's traumatizing the parents, and we want the schools to do better. So we need allies in the school. We need teachers to be allies. We need other white parents to be allies. And we need you to be asking the schools, what are you teaching our children? What in the curriculum is related to being Black? For instance, when we were, you know, they taught about World War I and II, but they're never shown pictures about the Caribbean regiment, which were all Black people. We're not expecting you to do a big presentation on that as a teacher, but if you're showing pictures about soldiers, show them that regiment as well. Let children understand that it's not just white people that made this country what it is.
I think that's a beautiful spot.
People who look like me have contributed to that. Sorry, you know, I'm a chatterbox, sorry.
I think that you've made a lot of really key points. And I think one of the, you know, because I want to draw in those so that we can really hear those points too, is that, you know, you've talked again, as Ella did, about listening to voices. And you've talked about, you know, educators. I'm an educator. I have been an educator for a long time. And although I'm Latinx, you know, I'm not Black and I'm not British Asian, you know, my context is different. And so, you know, what you're saying and what you're challenging those of us who are listening right now is that we need to come to this with a certain sense of humility. If I, as a teacher, have been told by a student that I'm not doing, that it's not good enough, then I need to be better. I need to listen to those voices. And I think that's ultimately what you're trying to say, is that you're coming, you're saying, I have trauma here. How can we then, as educators, improve? And that's where we're wanting to look at solutions. And you've mentioned solutions. Not only have you brought in solutions as a parent to your children's schools, but you've mentioned solutions. You've talked about, you know, decolonizing the curriculum, which is a huge thing. You know, there's a question I'm going to come to eventually about Black History Month, if we have time during the Q&A. But, you know, how is our education situated? Whose voices are centered? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves as educators. And then, as you said as well, as educators, what are we doing on a daily basis to improve our responses to these situations that continually come up? Because clearly our responses, if that's what this, you know, we've seen, clearly our responses haven't been good enough in the past. And so the question then is, how can we listen? How can we hear better? And so thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you for all that you've done in advocating for that and in challenging that it is uncomfortable. And that is something that, in order to be anti-racist and in order to make things better, people need to be okay with. It is going to be uncomfortable. And that's a very small slice of discomfort for all of the very many situations that are happening on a daily basis. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to bring Tyra in now. And again, we've gone student, a parent, and student again, to bring back any ideas for our audience members, when we're thinking about solutions, we've shared our experiences. What are things that as a student would have made you feel better during your experience?
I keep coming back to the point of having something or someone to relate to, as that is something that I didn't really have throughout my time at secondary school. But I think the main thing for me that sort of reaches all students and all teachers is the curriculum, and the fact that in a lot of, well, the majority of the curriculum across all subjects, sort of education in relation to sort of Black history and BAME content is a choice rather than compulsory. And I feel like a lot of schools come with the approach of, because the school is like predominantly white, it doesn't affect the majority of students, therefore we don't need it. And that's something that I've definitely experienced, is that because it doesn't affect the majority of people, it's not needed, when actually it is. Every student,
doesn't it?
Yeah. Every student should feel welcome. And I've sort of from day one really not felt welcome from that first incident that I had at secondary school, and then sort of the comments in class, etc., all that sort of stuff. But I also feel like in regards to solutions, there's very few teachers of colour, and it has got more diverse over the years, which is great. However, I still feel like there's not adequate training in relation to dealing with, racial incidents. And I feel like some members of staff are scared. They're scared to say something wrong. And, that's good, because they don't want to say something wrong, and it shows that they care and it shows that they want to help. But providing that training in the first place would be something that helps significantly, I think. But also, introducing BAME content into the curriculum would be something else. It's like, you're there to learn, and why not put it in, if regardless of whether it affects everybody or not. It is something that I do think should be there, because I believe that the introduction of BAME content and BAME content in general is something that does affect everybody, and it is something that should be there, because school is somewhere that is preparing you for the big wide world, and in the big wide world it isn't just predominantly white and you're a minority. And from a white person's perspective as well, it's not always going to be you're socializing and you're doing things with white peers. You are going to come across people of color in your lifetime. But for me, I think the main thing is curriculum, but also training for teachers and making sure that they feel like they're in a position to help students, because I feel like a lot of teachers are scared and afraid that they're not going to do or say the right thing. I think training is just something that needs to be happening.
Thank you so much, Tyra. So again, two amazing, really clear solutions in terms of curriculum. I know in the Q&A there was one question about resources, and we can hopefully respond with some options and some people in the Sheffield Rotherham area who are working on curriculum. I know several different places, and we can look to getting back to you as well. But working on our curriculum is absolutely a huge thing. And then also that training. Tyra brought up that sometimes people do care. And again, I saw in the chat or the Q&A, somebody who is positioned as white middle-class woman who, really wants to be able to be in this, space. And I think that is so, so important. And so that training, and again, always coming back to that listening of experience will help so much in terms of how that's approached. Muna, if you could come in, and we've been talking about solutions and again, draw it in together for us as we think about some of the different things that our panelists have said.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll echo things that many of the panelists have already said, and start off by saying that language is really important. We all come into this work from different perspectives, from different lived experiences, and we sometimes make the assumption that people understand the language that we're using when we try and explain what we're trying to explain, whether it's to do with systemic racism, whiteness, white privilege, microaggressions, etc. We assume that there is a shared understanding of that language, and there very often isn't. And so having a space to be able to have that shared understanding of what we mean when we use particular terms is really important, because that gives people the confidence to be able to engage with the language. Often I hear people saying, I want to be able to have conversations about race and racism, but I'm worried about saying the wrong thing, or I'm worried about offending someone. And that worry about language can be quite paralyzing and mean that people just don't have those conversations at all. The other thing I would say is it's really important to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Conversations about race and racism are not comfortable for anybody. People of color have the lived experience of it and we're directly impacted by it, but that doesn't mean those conversations are any more comfortable for us than they would be anybody else that's involved in it. So recognizing that these are uncomfortable spaces and necessarily uncomfortable, and we all have to just embrace that and work with that. The other thing I would say, and Tyra pointed at this perfectly, is we sometimes expect people to engage with things without giving them the tools to be able to engage with it. And if we are expecting there to be change within schools, that change needs to be supported and resourced to enable it to happen. Teachers are working very long hours in a very intense work environment, and we've seen with COVID-19 just how much teachers are going above and beyond in terms of their profession. There is individual responsibility, absolutely. There is a school-based responsibility, and then there is the institutional responsibility and systemically around what education is. For teachers, I would really say take some time to think about your own experiences within the classroom, depending on what your positionality is, whatever that is. Take some time to reflect on how others might be experiencing the space differently to you, and think about what informs your judgment. We take a lot of things for granted in our profession, where we go in and we think, okay, I have a certain amount of knowledge and my job as a teacher is to deliver that knowledge and facilitate the space. We don't take into account the power dynamics very often in what informs our decisions. So just taking some time to think about that and ask those questions of, how am I delivering this curriculum that I have? And that's a starting point for decolonizing as well. Is it? You have to start with decolonizing yourself before you even get to the curriculum. On a collective school level, I really think it's about leadership within schools, taking ownership and embracing the importance of anti-racism work, making sure that teachers have the time and space to develop the language, have those difficult conversations, work together collaboratively to develop the resources that they need to, and with the wider community that they're a part of. And where we have the real systemic change is where we start right at the very beginning, and that is teacher education. And I think if we can go to the root of the problem, which is what are we essentially equipping these teachers with before they enter into the classroom, that will have a ripple effect on everybody that's affected, from other teachers, from other staff members in the school, from students and to parents. If we can give those teachers the confidence during their teacher education program to look at some of these issues, they will come into the classroom with much more confidence to embrace it in spaces that are much more intense in terms of time and a lack of resources, etc. It really is about giving people the tools they need to be able to work with the things that they're going to encounter. And as other people have said, representation. The more people you can have with different lived experiences, different worldviews in the room, the more creative that space is going to be, the more innovative that space is going to be, and the more aware you will be of things that are clearly in your blind spot. And we all have blind spots. So I'm talking about representation in the broadest sense, but also recognizing that, especially with racism, there is a reason why we haven't got very many Black teachers within schools. And there is a reason why a lot of the Black teachers we do have are not progressing and are leaving. The education system and the health system are the two biggest employers when it comes to ethnic minority professionals, but they're also the poorest in terms of retention. So it's not just about paying attention to how we bring in more Black teachers, but really paying attention to why they're leaving. And that tells you about the culture of the school spaces that we have at the moment as well. So teacher education, representation, giving people the tools and the resources they need to confidently engage in this work, and having a shared language. And finally, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. I've given you 5, I could do a lot more, but I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that's what we're looking for, right? We're looking for those key things that we can do. And before I go to the questions, I just want to reiterate that idea of being uncomfortable and being okay with being wrong sometimes. Sometimes when we begin to engage in these conversations, whether it's about race or another issue that perhaps where your position is not as familiar with, we will make mistakes. And the big thing is that are we apologizing? Are we apologizing to our students if the way that we responded wasn't right the first time? Are we listening to our students if they're telling us that this isn't going well? And it's okay to be wrong. I recently had a colleague who wanted to, really tackle and bring into a lesson some ideas about racism, and she asked me to kind of go over it. And I thought not only did she approach it with such, she advocated for it. This is a teacher who is white or racialized as white, and not only did she, advocate for it, so it wasn't just me or the one other person of color in our department who needed to do that, but she also was okay and comfortable and humble enough to say, could you look at it? And then when I did have a few things where I said, actually, the wording here is, let's have a few changes, she was completely open to that, and she didn't become defensive. And so in the end, when we're talking about what can we do, she was able to create a resource, an educational resource in terms of this is an English class, that was really positive, and to do that in a way that wasn't traumatizing to me, that listened to other voices, and that hopefully began to bring things into the department that are opening up these conversations for our students and for all of our students. So what I'd like to do as we come to just kind of our Q&A session, and to the panelists, anybody who'd like to respond, please just take your camera off. One question that's come up a few times is about Black History Month, and I think it's a question that many people have already engaged with in the past, but also that people often have ideas about. And it just says, do you think Black History Month is useful or divisive? Is it just a time to see it as a kind of a separate space, or instead of being part of the whole of UK history? So if there's any panelists that might want to respond to kind of what they think in terms of having a Black History Month in their place of school. Melissa, if you go for just a few minutes, and then Tyra, and we'll just all stay on and discuss.
For me as a parent, ideally I would prefer my children to be learning about Black related stuff in all subjects where it's relevant. So when we're learning about World War I and World War II, you talk also about the Caribbean regiments. When you're talking about maths, you might talk about the origins of maths and, the country it came from. So I want it to, for me, I want it to just be normal I don't want time set aside. I just want it to be part of the curriculum, because we're not a standalone, we're here all the time, we're not going anywhere. So, when you're doing food tech, do something Caribbean related, or something about African food. I want it to be part of the everyday curriculum. And if we do continue with Black History Month, I think it's really important for the children to be learning about Black UK contributions, because what I find in schools, when teachers use their own initiatives, they just pick out Black entertainers, predominantly from America. And again, that's what worth are you then putting on the Black British child? You're saying all they're good for is entertaining, and you're also saying that actually there's no one in Britain who's worth learning about. And so I feel that, for me, I feel that's what we should do. Sorry, I could go on about it forever.
So again, from your perspective, and obviously you're one person and one parent, but from your perspective, you're again talking about that threading throughout that importance and decentering whiteness as the only way to be British and the only contribution. And then also that if you're going to do Black History Month, we've got to be more thoughtful about what we're doing. And again, I think that is something that I've seen definitely be done, is a lot of American stuff when that's just simply not the same context. Tyra, do you have any thoughts on that? I know that your school has now started to do something a bit more, you know, kind of you've experienced both.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Melissa in the fact that the figures that are used in Black History Month shouldn't be sort of, you know, entertainers, but also, you know, not the basics. Everybody, I'd like to think that, you know, most people know about, you know, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, all that sort of stuff. It's sort of going into more depth about that. I also think that Black history should be across all curriculum contents, and it should just be a part of everyday education. And then we obviously have the month where we focus on that. But all in all, I think that Black history should be something that is taught every day, as well as the month, just because you know we do live in a multicultural society. It is something that will affect all of us at some point, and the education system needs to acknowledge that and find a way to present it to staff and students to essentially prepare them for the wider world.
Fantastic, thank you. Carrying on with our questions, it's actually, it says, as a student, so I don't know if Ella and Tyra might particularly want to respond, as a student in a secondary school, although also as an educator, if we come across any racist behavior, how are we supposed to respond? Again, I feel like I'm asking you and I'm putting this on you. And so if anybody wants to respond to that, you know, feel free. But as a student in secondary school, if we come across racist behavior, how are we supposed to respond? And I think, you know, and that comes from any direction of student, a white student, a British Asian student, whichever direction. Ella? And Tyra, you can stay on as we're listening.
I think with racism, it's not just about the punishment, the consequence of the incident. I think it's about what can be learned from it, because whenever I think about, you know, I feel like that there are lots of examples, but just racial slurs to begin with. It's not just the fact they said it, it's that you don't ever want them to say it again to anyone else. You never want anyone else to have to experience what you've gone through. So I think it's responding and just taking the time to correct them and make them understand why it's wrong, so that in the future they don't make the same decision again. I think often we just kind of skip the, oh, what you did was wrong, here's why you shouldn't do it again, here's how it makes people feel, and like the consequences of what's been done, and just go, oh, be excluded for a day. Like, it's not enough, because they're just going to do it again. They won't take the time to kind of reflect on what they've done and not do it again.
Mm-hmm. So you're looking again at that response and how can we prevent that from happening again? Tyra, any thoughts?
I definitely agree with Ella, but also just sort of coming with that approach of being anti-racist, for me is something that needs to be more present. You know, if a student was pointing out another student and calling them fat, I'm pretty sure that, you know, nobody would not say anything. I think that is something you'd pull that person up and say, look, this isn't acceptable, you can't be saying that, think about how that person feels, etc., all that sort of stuff. As whereas when it's a racial comment, it's sort of, you know, whether it's a stereotypical comment or a racial slur, that's something that again is sort of just ignored and brushed under the carpet. You know, people make a conscious decision to not highlight or acknowledge that it's happened. So for me, it's coming with that anti-racist approach, and the fact that if somebody's saying something that isn't nice, just because it's got something to do with race, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't call that person out for it.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I think, you know, as an educator, what I would say to a student is that If you're a bystander, as Tyra said, calling that out, and then are you asking that person who's experienced it, are you asking them if they're okay? Are you saying, would you like me to report that? Or maybe you are reporting that. Are you going with them to be a supportive voice? So there's a lot of ways that you can be supportive, so you're not leaving it to the person who's experienced that racism to do all of the work, and you're able to say, that's not all right. You're able to ask people, how are they feeling, and then you're able to go as a witness to support the student who's experienced it. And I think that helps sometimes in terms of the dismissal that we've heard of. So those are a few thoughts on that. We have time for another question, and Muna, I think it might be great if you consider responding to this. It says, how do we encourage schools to more centrally decolonize the curriculum in different subjects? This person's worried about children walking away without any knowledge of colonialism and what that is. So just kind of any thoughts in terms of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key is demystifying what decolonizing the curriculum actually is. And I think sometimes schools who do embrace work around decolonizing the curriculum will actually diversify as opposed to decolonize. And they'll interpret that as decolonizing the curriculum means including more authors of color, or it means including sections of the curriculum that are specifically around African history or slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, so on and so forth. And decolonizing the curriculum is really about having a set of tools to critically think that can be used in any subject area. And if there were training, if there were spaces within the school, and some schools have done this really well, where they've got curriculum forums, where they've got development days for staff, etc., where work can be done to build up those critical skills. And it really is about asking the question of, what knowledge do we prioritize in the curriculum? How do we convey that knowledge to students and allow them to engage with it? What knowledges do we not include? What can we include in order to create more of an opportunity for students to see knowledges from all over the world? How do we put that, how do we reflect that in our assessments, etc.? Getting those broader questions asked, but to centralize it, it really does need leadership. It needs the school to commit to taking an anti-racist approach to their teaching and learning, and to be willing to take on these tools of critical thinking into their curriculum development in all subject areas. And that sometimes means not just having leadership on board, but it means having a point of accountability in leadership as well. So somebody whose job it's going to be to ensure that this work is done. So, and I would really advise that that person isn't somebody that is part of a staff working group, because often this work is work that is voluntary. And when it's work that is voluntary, it's a huge amount of burden, and it's usually short-lived because it doesn't have the backing of the structures. And so it's really important for it to be somebody in senior leadership that has the accountability to ensure that this work is followed through. And that's one way it can be sustained within the school space and on it centrally.
Fantastic. And one of the things that you said, and possibly might want to explain even further, is you talked about that diversity isn't the same as decolonizing. And I think one thing that is so important for educators to understand as we move forward is that representation is fantastic, and it is fantastic to start to see, you know, I see one of the questions here of just, can we hopefully at least just not have every image in the school not be quite so white centered, and every, you know, math problem have a name that is perhaps white coded is the word that they've used.
Mm-hmm.
And those are steps. Those are definitely multicultural steps. And ultimately, representation doesn't dismantle the systemic issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so just, you know, thinking about that, Walter Mignolo says that, you know, coloniality ontologizes or teaches in such a way that it's not unusual to find racist heteronormative beliefs among men of color and among white women, you know, that representation doesn't mean that you're anti-racist, and that a person can hold some views no matter what their background is. And so that what you spoke about in terms of decolonizing it or being anti-racist, I think is really, really essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why whenever we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, we always say it needs to start with what brings the curriculum to life. And that is the individuals that are in the room. So if you as an educator are not doing work on yourself to ask those questions around how am I informing, what's informing my judgment on what knowledge is, on my view of the world, what can I do differently, etc. Anything that you look at in terms of the text will be interpreted through your lens. So there can be very diverse curriculums that are delivered in really racist and problematic ways, because that work hasn't been undertaken to look critically at not just the content that we're putting into the curriculum, but how is that content being delivered and assessed within the spaces that we're in as well. So diversity just means embracing difference. It really is looking at this at a very superficial level. It's a starting point, and it's a really important starting point, but that's all it is. And if that's the only thing that we engage with in decolonizing the curriculum, the only thing that we're going to have is different names, people that look differently within our literature, but the culture of how that teaching and learning takes place will remain the same.
Fantastic. I think this is again, in terms of these, there's several questions about resources, educating, how do we change, and what do we do in order to make our curriculum better, as you know, we've been exhorted to do so by our panelists. And it's so important. Margaret Hagerman's research talks about the way that children's ideas about race become quite firm in middle childhood. So, you know, key stage 3, some of these ideas carry on, and then ultimately, for a child who's racialized as white, just being around people who are of color does not necessarily mean that they have listened and that they're anti-racist. That it takes that, as you said, that critical thinking. How are educators encouraging critical thinking, offering the tools? I know one school that uses form time in order to provide those tools, particularly during Black History Month, and that training is done for the students as well during those form meetings. Can we as educators advocate for that? If you're a parent listening, can you call your head teacher and ask them, where is this happening at your school? So there's so many things that we can do, and that in your position as a student, as a parent, as an educator, that you can push and advocate for your school to do in order to improve these pieces. And you know, with that being said, I'd like to just again thank our panelists so much. There's so much that we could go into, and so much theory that we could you know, consider more deeply. But I want to leave you with one more thought, and that is that as you're considering and reflecting on this time, and reflecting on these experiences and solutions, that every single person is able to do two things. They're able to reflect on their own positionality, their own experiences, and hopefully learn and understand how better to decenter themselves. And also to organize. Even if you don't know how, find the space in which you can do that, not just tomorrow, not just next week, following these conversations, but carry on with that work. Keep finding it. If you are someone who's watching and you're positioned in a way in which perhaps these conversations are uncomfortable for you, you know, lean into that discomfort and find ways in order to keep advocating for anti-racism in schools. Again, thank you so much for being part of this today, and I'll turn it over to Joe as we finish up our panel. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Monica, and for all of our panelists for running tonight's event. I certainly learned loads myself. That wraps up tonight's event. There's a live poll running at the moment. If you'd like to give us a little bit of feedback, or you can send us any comments to the Festival of Debate email address, hello@festivalofdebate.com. The Festival of Debate is running till June the 6th. There's a whole range of different great events happening between now and then. We've got David Lammy coming next week, which I'm particularly excited about, but there's lots and lots to get stuck into, so please do check out the full programme at festivalofdebate.com. Thank you very much everyone for joining us this evening. Cheers, good night.